Welcome back to another fine edition of Personal Stories and Dramatic Readings, where I talk about personal experiences with books and do dramatic readings of the books and do reactions to books that I've never read before. As of recently, we've been going through the third book in the Clue series, which is really just a collection of shorter mysteries. And I have fully accepted at this point that logic will be thrown out the window until we're trying to solve the mystery. So, here we go. Here is Story 5. Bad Taste. Pancakes! Announced Mrs. White, smiling sweetly. She rolled the silver serving tray into the dining room and began serving breakfast to the sleepy guests. But every time she turned back to the cart, her smile changed to a grimace. "Great griddles!" exclaimed Colonel Mustard with his mouth full. "Mrs. White makes the finest flapjacks in the world," agreed Mr. Body, happily shoveling in a large fork. I'll have seconds if you don't mind," said Mrs. Peacock, daintily wiping her lips with a napkin as she shoved the plate forward. "Of course," said Mrs. White with a smile. She turned back to the cart, frowned, then turned back and served Miss Peacock with a smile. I get the feeling that inside Mrs. White just wants to see them all go alila bye-bye in the worst way, and she just keeps it to herself the whole time. Okay. But no sooner than she had served Mrs. Peacock than Miss Scarlet wanted more. Then Professor Plum handed over his empty plate. Then Mr. Green. "Thirds, replied Mrs. Peacock, handing her plate again. In short, the guests were going crazy for Mrs. White's pancakes. The pancake tower on her serving tray was growing shorter and shorter, but the guests kept asking for more and more. They were eating the pancakes faster than Mrs. White could serve them. And as they turned faster and faster from the cart to the table, she had to change her smile into a scowl and back again more and more quickly. Soon she got confused that she was smiling while her back was turned and grimacing while she was facing the guests. "Mrs. White," asked Mustard, wiping syrup off of his cheek, "is there anything wrong?" "Not at all," said Mrs. White with a sweet smile. She turned back. Then she whipped around with an angry scowl and muttered directly to the guests, Except that I'm sick of serving you buffoons." Buffoons is a rude word and beneath you," commented Mrs. Peacock with her mouth full. "Perhaps you're overworked." "But I love my job," said Mrs. White loudly with a smile while facing her cart. Then she whirled back with a grimace and mumbled, It's idiots like you that I can't." She froze mid-sentence, suddenly aware of her mistake. A smile and a scowl rapidly changed on her face. Then she fainted. When she came to, she found herself lying on the sofa in the ballroom. She looked around the room. It was empty. Then she heard sounds of glass clinking and laughter tinkling. She slowly got to her feet. The sounds were wafting their way from the kitchen. She followed the noise. "Won't she be surprised?" she heard a voice say. A, a smell of smoke and something else. Skunk? Entered Mrs. White's nose. She yanked open the kitchen door. There were pots and pans everywhere, mixing bowls, open cookbooks, cereals, meats, vegetables, cutting boards, batters, soups, rising bread dough, and 3 live turkeys cluttered the room. Each guest was wearing a different color chef's hat. They all looked at Mrs. White, guilty faces. "What's going on?" she asked, holding her head and starting to sway. Miss Scarlet caught her elbow. "We wanted to surprise you. We decided you've been working too hard," added Colonel Mustard. He flipped an omelet and it landed with a splat on top of Mr. Green's tall chef hat. "We're making you lunch," said Mr. Green, ignoring the omelet. "Go put up your feet." "What's with all the smoke?" Mrs. White asked, trying to breathe deeply, trying not to breathe too deeply. "I'm gobble," asked one of the turkeys. It waddled over to the maid and eyed her curiously. Mrs. Peacock laughed. "Oh, the smell. Yes, well, you see, Miss Scarlet was making scarlet chicken flamble. Professor Plum started to make it, but he was making kitchen flambe instead." And the turkeys?" asked the horrified Mrs. White. Professor Plum scratched his head under his purple chef's hat. "I thought this recipe called for them," he said, studying the cookbook. "But now I don't see where—" "I don't either," snapped Mr. Green. "Since when does a recipe for stewed plums call for live turkeys?" "Everything will be fine," Colonel Mustard said, taking the maid firmly by the arm. He led her from the kitchen back into the ballroom. "You just relax and let us serve you." That's kind of the weird thing about this book series. It's like, in one story, they're all buddies and friends and working together kind of thing, and then in the next, they're trying to kill each other. It's a weird series. 2 hours later, Mr. Green rang the bell. "My mouth is watering already," Mrs. White told Mr. Body as they headed for the dining room. "It certainly smells delicious." Did you bring the stomach medicine?" the maid added under her breath. "Do you think 3 bottles will be enough?" whispered Mr. Body. In the dining room, the guests were all aligned up in a row behind their dishes. The dishes were all hidden beneath silver lids. Streams of foul-smelling steam were slithering out from each metal dish. The chefs bowed low as Mr. Body and Mrs. White entered the room. "Welcome to the finest meal of your life," boasted Mr. Green, and the chefs lifted the lids and began to serve. "Oh, I think I'll start with—" But Mr. Green dumped a large mound of his green salad on her plate, and then the professor globbed on 3 big spoonfuls of his stewed plums. By the time the maid had made it down the line, she had a huge portion of each dish. She sat down slowly. "Begin!" instructed Colonel Mustard. "Oh, that's okay," said Mrs. White with a tiny smile. "I'll wait." Soon everyone had been served and was sitting down ready to eat. "This is so exciting," said Mr. Body. Mr. Body said, "Now, who will take the first bite?" They all turned to Mrs. White. "Our guest of honor," said Mrs. Peacock. Mrs. White took a small taste of everything on her plate. Mmm. She kept humming and nodding her head and waving in appreciation. Mr. Body went next. He tried a spoonful of the stewed plums, which was smeared with mustard's mustard. He took a large bite. All the chefs watched him closely. "This is delicious," he said. "Wirely? Riley? I think. It's W-R-Y-L-Y. Riley, I think. I don't know." Then he made an odd face. "Delicious isn't the word," he finally stammered, reaching out for the water pitcher. Miss Scarlet tried a bite of the greens. Then she quickly took a bite of peacock stew. Then even more quickly took a bite of her own scarlet chicken. Colonel Mustard smeared his own mustard onto a piece of scarlet chicken and swallowed it happily. Then he, too, grabbed for the water pitcher, but by now Mr. Body had drunk it all. Mustard gasped in agony. Professor Plum tried the greens and the peacock stew. Mrs. Peacock sampled the scarlet chicken and the greens. They both made very funny faces. "So it's the scarlet chicken." Suddenly, Mrs. White leapt to her feet. She was turning blue, then green, then every color in the rainbow. Then she began to make horrible gargling sound. Then Colonel Mustard and Mr. Body leaped to their feet. Their faces began to change color as well. The three of them started to stagger around. They looked as if they were about to die. They were. For while all the guests' creations tasted horrible, all of them tasted horrible. One was so bad it was deadly, and only these three had tasted it. It was the chicken, I think. Yeah, it was the chicken. It was, Miss Scarlet. That's my guess. But post your thoughts down below in the comments. Alright, now let's see what they say. Mustard's mustard made in the kitchen and served in the dining room. We know that only Body, Mustard, and Mrs. White had the violent reaction. Body had the plums and the mustard. Mustard had the mustard and Scarlet's chicken. Only Mustard is on both lists. Mrs. White tasted everything, so she had the mustard as well. Luckily, Mr. Body remembered his 3 bottles of stomach medicine just in time. It saved their lives, but not their appetites. Okay, that I actually buy. Alright, next story is a very important poison. Excuse me. "Do you have any 5s, Miss Scarlet?" asked Mr. Green, studying his cards. "No," said Miss Scarlet, sneaking a peek at Mrs. Peacock's cards. "Go fish." "I think I'm beginning to understand this game," said Mr. Body with a jolly smile. Just then the study door opened. Mrs. White pushed in a silver tray laden with 6 cups of steaming cocoa. She wheeled the tray around the guests, who were sitting on the floor in a circle. Mrs. White stood behind Mr. Green. She held up 3 fingers over his head. She winked at Mrs. Peacock. "Do you have any 3s?" Mrs. Peacock asked, Mr. Green winking back at Mrs. White. Mr. Green frowned, then cleared his throat. "Go fish." "There's something fishy going on here," Mrs. Peacock grumbled. She reached into the fish pile. Mrs. White looked at her tray. She had an extra cup of cocoa. "Where's Professor Plum?" she asked. "I don't know," said Colonel Mustard. "He was playing with us before, but then I told him to go fish and..." "Oh dear, yes," said Mrs. White. "I see." She glanced out the window toward the body pond. "I don't want to know how it got its name." But no one was there. Suddenly, Mrs. Peacock threw down her cards. "Green is cheating." "Oh, yeah?" barked Green, jutting out his jaw in a menacing manner. Mrs. Peacock jutted out her jaw as well. "Yeah! I mean, yes!" Mr. Green crossed his arms over his chest. "Mrs. White's the one who's cheating," he said. She's giving signals. Don't you dare try to pin it on me." "Well, it's just a card game," began Mr. Body. "It doesn't really..." "Miss Scarlet is cheating, not me," interrupted Miss White. "You mean Colonel Mustard, I believe," said Miss Scarlet, pointing a long finger at the Colonel. "Right, cheater. You dare to accuse me of cheating? I challenge you to a duel." "All of us?" asked Mrs. White. "But Miss Scarlet is the one who accused you." "Questioning my judgment, eh? Mrs. White, I challenge you to a duel!" "You already did." Mrs. White mocked. "Mocking me? I challenge you to a duel! Another duel! And another thing. Ladies and gentlemen, please," interrupted Body. "Interrupting?" said Mustard. "I challenge you too!" "Mr. Body's right, Mustard," said Green. "You shouldn't take the game so seriously." "I take it too seriously, eh? I challenge you again!" Mrs. Peacock yawned and looked at her watch. "At this rate, he'll be challenging us all night." Just then, a voice in a far-off room shrieked, "Eureka!" There was a clatter of footsteps, and Professor Plum rushed into the study. He was carrying a jar of purple liquid. "Look what I've created!" The guests looked. "What is it?" they all asked. It's... Plum stared at the jar of purple liquid in his hand. "I forgot what it is." Professor sniffed the liquid, then sipped it. "Ah, yes, now I remember. Poison!" "Poison!" gasped the guest. "Yes, poison," said Plum proudly. "I call it Evapole. Because once it's inside your body, it evaporates. There isn't the slightest trace of the poison left. Don't you see?" This is the poison criminals have been searching for. And you just announced it to a room full of criminals, genius. A poison that leaves no clues behind. And just one sip is enough to... Enough to what? Cried Mr. Body. But Professor Plum had gone stiff as a board. He slowly toppled, falling flat on his face. All the guests rushed to Plum's side. They began to wrestle over the jar of the poison, clutched in his hand. Colonel Mustard got to the jar first, but Mr. Green snatched it away. This discovery would be worth millions! Yes! Miss Scarlet said Green. Yes! Miss Scarlet grabbed the jar from Mr. Green. It's a very important poison. Of course, Plum is a very important person, said Body, who was trying to revive the professor. That's why we've got to help him. Here, give me that. He pulled the jar away from Miss Scarlet. I'm going to put this away for safekeeping in the meanwhile. Someone call a doctor for the professor. He ran out of the room. The guests carried Plum into the library. Mrs. Peacock called the doctor. The phone rang, but there was no answer. How rude! Exclaimed Mrs. Peacock. As she hung up, the guests propped Plum against the wall. Meanwhile, Mr. Body had hidden the jar of purple poison underneath the billiard table. It'll be safe here for the time being, Mr. Body told himself. Then he left the room. He was right. It would have been safe, except none of the guests had been. One of the guests had been watching him hide it. That guest now came out from behind the door, reached under the billiard table, and set the jar of poison on the table's green felt. Next, the guest took out 3 small darts. Excuse me of cheating, the guest muttered bitterly. Why, no one accuses me of cheating at Go Fish and lives to tell the tale. The guest carefully dipped each of the 3 darts into the thick purple liquid. Meanwhile, we've got to find it, cried Miss White, looking at Mr. Green. They were in the lounge going through the remains of Plum's experiments, hoping to find an antidote for the poison. The 2 of them were searching so frantically that they didn't notice that the door had led to the billiard room opened slightly. The hollow lead pipe noised into view. It was aimed right at them. Whoosh! The guest who was holding the lead pipe had just blown one of the purple poison darts through it. At the same instant, Mr. Body burst into the lounge through the secret passageway from the conservatory. Any luck? He asked, standing in front of Mr. Green and Mrs. White. Mr. Green and Mrs. White both shook their heads. The poison dart struck Mr. Body in the rump. Miss, muttered the guest at the door. The lead pipe disappeared from view. Body yelped. He gave Mrs. White an odd look. Mrs. White, he said, one should never pinch one's boss. Thanks for the advice, said Mrs. White, giving him a strange look. We've been through the whole room, Mr. Body. I don't think the professor invented an antidote for this stuff. Well, keep searching, ordered Body. Then he rushed to the study to see how the professor was doing. Oh, Professor Plum, said Body, you're back on your feet again. Relief spread rapidly over Mr. Body's round face, but the professor, who was leaning against the wall, didn't say a word. You gave us quite a scare, let me tell you, but I guess you didn't drink enough of the poison to harm you, eh? The professor didn't answer. Suddenly, Mr. Body realized the truth. He started back away as Plum began to fall. But just then, Body himself stiffened up like a board. The two men fell straight over, crashed into each other, and propped each other up like tent poles. There's no time to lose. We've got to find that antidote, Mr. Green said as he hurried into the room. He stopped short, then he saw the two frozen men. Now that's what I call putting your heads together, said Mrs. White as she entered behind Green. Look! Mr. Green pointed to the dart that was sticking out of Body's bottom. Mrs. White pulled out the dart and examined the purple-stained tip. Looks like we have to find more than an antidote, she said. Yes, said Mr. Green. We have to find the killer. Who killed Mr. Body? Who do you guys think killed Mr. Body? 'Cause right now I have no idea. Alright, so I'm just going to read the solution since I have no freaking idea. Okay, solution. Miss Scarlet outside the lounge with the lead pipe. The killer was seeking revenge for being accused of cheating during Go Fish. Miss Scarlet was the only guest outside the lounge accused by either Mr. Green or Mrs. White. By the way, Plum really did forget what his discovery was. It wasn't poison at all. It was a sleeping potion. Body and Plum woke up an hour later, found themselves leaning against each other, and fell to the floor. Well, that's a little awkward. Well, that's all for now on dramatic readings and personal stories. I hope you guys enjoyed it because I had fun reading it, and I will see you guys next time. And my hair looks red in this light.